All right. Okay. So, can the comrades at the back take their seats, please? Comrades at the back, please come in, take your seat. Okay. They know you're speaking in French, I told them.
We can change the language here.
Can I get information about the French channel on the interpretation? We've told the interpreters. Okay. Okay. Because Marina's speaking in French. We've told the
interpreters,
but she's asking which is the channel to hear French. So I think we're okay. Okay. Okay, comrades. A TUED tradition is when we produce materials, reports, we have meetings like this to discuss the content and to get feedback. When we started TUED South, the meeting in Nairobi in October 2022, we had a 50,000-word document. So think yourself very lucky that this was only a 10,000-word document. Seriously, though, the thinking behind this document is based on what we're saying is a new reality in terms of climate and energy policy and how the unions and their allies and governments respond to that new situation. So I've got only 3 or 4 slides here, and I'll keep my comments as brief as possible so we can hand over to our brilliant panel here. This document was sent out by email, and I resent it about an hour ago. It's with an eye on COP30, but also there's the Finance for Development Conference, and there are other possibilities to begin to articulate what is called a new international energy order. Now, those of you who've had the time to look at the document, it evokes, deliberately so, the memories of the new international economic order really the process began in the 50s and stretched through to the 70s with the Bandung Conference in Indonesia and then onwards into the 70s. That was a radical attempt to assert a global South agenda, a unity of purpose agenda. So it's in that spirit that the document is written to respond to the current reality. So next slide. Okay, so the document makes a few kind of, I think, provocative suggestions. The first is that the climate policy that we've been seeing now for 30 years is actually falling apart, and it's falling apart very quickly. Of course, then the question is, if that assessment is correct, and we'll discuss this more in groups tomorrow, then how do we as unions respond, but also how do the South generally respond to that reality? And it's common knowledge now that what we saw at COP29 was a stepping back from commitments on climate finance. We've seen with the Trump election, of course, the tearing up of the Paris Agreement, which of course he can't do, but certainly having an effect on the global realities. And we've also seen now, and this is going to be one of the subjects of our panel today, is the difficulties, let's just call it that Europe is facing in terms of meeting its commitments and the question of industrial competitiveness, loss of jobs, deindustrialization, and the emergence of a green protectionist trend, not just in Europe, but also in the US and elsewhere. Now, I think what the paper asserts is that this failure is not just about Trump getting elected, and it's not really just about the competitiveness question. The whole green growth model was based on the idea that if you do climate protection climate protection in one country, climate protection in one continent, that you will have a competitive advantage over your rivals. That has not turned out to be the case. So there's data in the document I would urge you to look at. Now, the right wing will say, well, let's get rid of climate protection. It was always stupid. We're going to lose jobs. Economic suicide is the language they're using in Europe. And what we're saying or proposing in the paper is there needs to be a new energy cooperative model around the decarbonization process, that however difficult that might sound in terms of achieving it, has to be pursued. And the best ones to pursue it are the trade unions and their allies in the social movements and progressive governments like Mexico, Colombia, etc. The model we've seen for 30 years has not impeded the increase in emissions. It has not attracted investment because it relies on the private sector, and it's inflated the cost of the transition. Profit, laws of competition, the whole de-risking architecture of climate policy has been an enormous disaster in terms of not raising the amount of investment, but costing whatever investment is going forward is being subsidized by the public in order to guarantee private profit. So that's the first assertion. The second is the South must do something about it. In other words, the South at the level of the UN and the very multilateral processes, the G77 and China, have tended to have a very clear position, quite united position, in terms of telling the North that it hasn't met its obligations. But what we're proposing in the paper is that there are the means to respond to this within the South. Most of the energy in the world, its fuels and resources, are in the South. Most of the consumption of energy is now in the South. So we've got a situation where if there was enough political will and strategy, the South could become the climate leader that Europe claimed to be 10 or 12 years ago, and even more recent than that. Now, but we all know that the policies being pursued by some of the high-growth countries in the South, China, India, is very similar to this competitiveness model. And it's almost like saying, well, you made the rules, we're just better at doing it than you are. So now it's our time to have growth and prosperity because that's what you've got in the North. So there must be a way of, and this is the third point, of developing a program of action based on energy cooperation, true technology transfer, within a public goods framework. Because let's just say, for example, even the Chinese Communist Party leadership acknowledges there's a need for moderate prosperity and ecological civilization. So the words are there, but the policies being pursued, really by the big countries, North and South, are not, they will not facilitate the kind of global public goods approach that we need to address the climate emergency. And the paper concludes by saying that there are ways, if the South took a more assertive role, it could re-engage the North on a question of energy cooperation. And one fact which I'd like to emphasize that is in the paper, there's a lot of data in the paper, is that China is 82% of solar panel production globally, but it's only 33 or 34% of consumption. What does that mean? It means they've got a lot of solar panels and a lot of industrial manufacturing in solar, and we can say the same of electric vehicles, batteries, wind power, that will be idle. And what happened in the middle of the last decade, we saw the ending of the feed-in tariff in Europe, and what we saw then was massive bankruptcies of Chinese solar companies. So there has to be a model of cooperation that transcends the competitive capitalist dynamics. Of course, that's what we dream of, that's what we have to fight for, but these are, if we're to position ourselves in COP30 and beyond, then we need to have a response to this. If it's not this response, it needs to be another response. But anyway, submit the paper to you for your feedback, and we're opening up a process on this that will take some time, and we'll discuss it again tomorrow. So to kick us off, I want to start with Marina Mesure, who is a member of the Left Parliament, a member of the European Parliament, part of the Left group from France. Now, I think the English translation of your party is like the French Resistance, isn't it? Or can you say, maybe you'll correct my mistake. And then she's going to give a perspective from Europe about what's been going on with the whole battles around energy and climate policy and the rise of the right wing in many key countries. Then we're going to hear from Joel Akhator Odigie, the relatively new General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation's regional body in Africa, who has been so instrumental in getting TUED South off the ground. And lastly, Asad Rehman, the Executive Director of War on Want, which is, I think, speaking personally, the NGO that really captures class and climate in ways that I think if every NGO did it, we'd be in a lot stronger position. So without any further delay, Marina, I'm going to give you the microphone, and you have whatever you need.
Merci, Sean. Je tiens tout d'abord, donc je vais parler en français. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier chaleureusement les organisateurs de cet événement, TUED, qui nous permet aujourd'hui de nous rassembler dans ce moment important par ces échanges très riches depuis ce matin. Et parce que je pense sincèrement que le dialogue entre les travailleurs et travailleuses avec les syndicats est extrêmement important pour mener ce combat essentiel et commun que nous avons pour une gestion publique du secteur de l'énergie. Comme je vous le disais tout à l'heure en me présentant, je viens ici avec une double casquette, celui d'une ancienne syndicaliste française du secteur du bâtiment. Et j'ai œuvré pendant plusieurs années dans le syndicalisme international, dont je crois beaucoup à vous, c'est-à-dire à ce mouvement international syndical qui peut faire changer les choses. Je suis députée depuis 2022 au Parlement européen. Et maintenant, cette bataille, nous la menons aussi à ce niveau-là. Et effectivement, donc, pour revenir sur la présentation de Sean, il a bien montré que les politiques énergétiques que nous menons depuis 30 ans dans les pays du Nord global, en partant avec l'Union européenne en tête, sont pas du tout satisfaisantes, voire même dévastatrices. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'elles sont basées sur un modèle de croissance verte. Et ce modèle, c'est d'utiliser la transition écologique pour faire toujours plus de profits et pour la libéralisation de nos biens communs, dont l'énergie. Et donc, au Parlement européen, ce qu'on nous dit, c'est que si nous libéralisons le secteur de l'énergie, ça nous permettra notamment de développer les énergies renouvelables, qu'il faut refuser de confier à la puissance publique la fonction de planificateur. C'est ce modèle de croissance verte qui est promu par les institutions et qui a fait en sorte que nous ayons des textes et des lois qui mettent en place des mécanismes pour affaiblir le contrôle qu'on avait à l'époque avec de solides opérateurs publics historiques dans différents pays de l'Union européenne. Alors le résultat, ça a été celui que nous vivons actuellement, c'est-à-dire que vous avez aujourd'hui des entreprises comme en France, EDF qui était l'entreprise historique, l'opérateur historique, aujourd'hui EDF est obligé de vendre un tiers de son électricité à des concurrents à prix coûtant, qui eux-mêmes le revendent aux consommateurs au prix qu'ils veulent. Donc c'est-à-dire que c'est totalement aberrant comme système, puisque l'opérateur continue à vendre, à produire l'électricité. Les nouveaux concurrents sur le marché ne produisent rien en termes d'électricité, mais par contre peuvent revendre l'électricité plus chère aux ménages et aux entreprises notamment. Alors depuis l'ouverture à la concurrence, deux choses. On nous dit lorsque l'on privatise le secteur, on fait baisser les prix et on augmente nos capacités de production. Concrètement, dans les capacités de production, depuis que nous avons libéralisé le secteur, alors que nous étions pendant 50 ans sur une augmentation croissance de nos capacités de production, depuis que nous avons libéralisé le secteur en 2007, la production stagne. Donc il n'y a pas d'augmentation de la production énergétique dans l'Union européenne et notamment en France. Au niveau des prix, parce qu'on nous dit aussi, lorsqu'il y a de la concurrence, on fait baisser les prix, soi-disant. eh bien, les prix au niveau, par exemple, de mon pays, donc en France, depuis la libéralisation en 2007, c'est une augmentation de 137% du prix de l'électricité. Donc à tous les niveaux, la concurrence qui a été créée, qui est une concurrence totalement artificielle sur le marché, eh bien, ça a été désastreux pour nos entreprises, pour les ménages et pour la société dans son ensemble. Alors, pourquoi? Eh bien, il faut aller vers une puissance publique. D'abord, la puissance publique, elle a aussi cette stabilité financière et budgétaire qui lui permet aussi d'emprunter à des taux plus bas. Alors qu'une société, plusieurs études le montrent, une société privée emprunte sur le marché jusqu'à 2 fois plus cher que l'État. Donc c'est bien la puissance publique qui peut permettre des investissements dans les nouvelles capacités de production, et je pense aussi aux énergies renouvelables dont nous avons particulièrement besoin. Par ailleurs, ce dont nous avons besoin, c'est plus de coopération et moins de concurrence. Et cela, nous avons pu le voir dans plusieurs pays de l'Union européenne, où la coopération entre les États a toujours fonctionné avant même la libéralisation. Parce que l'argument qui nous est avancé, c'est que s'il n'y a pas de libéralisation, eh bien chaque État va fonctionner de manière autonome et ne sera coupé des autres États. Ce qui est totalement faux, puisque les interconnexions existaient avant la libéralisation et donc nous pouvons continuer à coopérer, à échanger de l'énergie et de l'électricité notamment, en sortant des règles du marché. Donc ça, c'est un deuxième point important. Effectivement, nous nous sommes confrontés à un moment où, comme tu le disais, nous avons l'arrivée massive de la droite et de l'extrême droite au niveau du Parlement européen depuis juin 2024, puisque la droite et l'extrême droite forment une nouvelle majorité au Parlement européen. Eh bien, avec elle, qu'est-ce qu'il y arrive? Plus de libéralisation, parce qu'ils sont pour plus de libéralisation. Et derrière aussi, c'est ouvertement l'arrêt du Green Deal, puisque ces partis de droite et d'extrême droite s'opposent aux normes environnementales et s'opposent même, sont des partis climato-sceptiques, s'opposent au Green Deal que nous avions porté au niveau européen, qui est de fait imparfait, mais en tout cas qui était important. Alors, face à cela, l'international réactionnaire s'organise. L'international réactionnaire, c'est qui? Eh bien, c'est Elon Musk, c'est des intérêts privés qui viennent au niveau international pour s'organiser, pour défendre les grands groupes au détriment de l'intérêt général. Eh bien, c'est l'international progressiste que nous défendons aussi à travers cette gestion publique du secteur de l'énergie en Europe et partout dans le monde. La gestion publique du secteur de l'énergie aussi, elle a franchi un cap, nouveau au niveau de l'Union européenne, puisque nous avons réformé, soi-disant, nos règles, il y a quelques mois, en se disant qu'après la crise a été dramatique. La crise, ça a été des millions de personnes qui ne pouvaient plus se chauffer du fait des coûts de l'énergie. Ça a été des dizaines de milliers d'entreprises qui ont fermé les unes après les autres. Eh bien, l'Union européenne a dit on a compris de nos erreurs et on va réformer le marché européen de l'électricité. Ils l'ont réformé avec plus de libéralisation. Ils n'ont toujours rien compris. C'est-à-dire que nous avons aujourd'hui une réforme sur la table qui va faire en sorte de faire entrer encore plus d'acteurs privés et encore moins de planification dans le secteur de l'énergie, avec des conséquences dramatiques que nous connaissons, et avec un marché qui continue, et ça je sais que c'est une spécificité européenne, qui continue à indexer le prix de l'électricité sur le prix du gaz. C'est-à-dire que vous pouvez avoir un mix énergétique, comme par exemple en France, où l'électricité produite à partir du gaz, c'est seulement 6%, mais ce 6% détermine le prix de toute l'électricité. Et concrètement, quand on a eu une augmentation des prix du gaz, comme nous avons pu le voir après la guerre en Ukraine, eh bien, les énergéticiens se sont gavés, littéralement gavés, parce qu'ils ont pu vendre une électricité beaucoup plus chère que ce qu'elle leur coûtait. C'est-à-dire les coûts de production restaient les mêmes, mais du jour au lendemain, vous pouviez continuer à produire à 40 € le mégawattheure, mais vendre sur le marché à 1 100 € le mégawattheure. Ces énergéticiens se sont fait des milliards d'euros pendant que le reste de la société, elle, ne pouvait plus avoir accès à ce bien essentiel. Donc tout ça pour vous dire que la bataille, elle est difficile au Parlement européen parce que nous sommes une minorité. Et d'ailleurs, dans l'introduction, on disait qu'on est aussi des fois une minorité de syndicats à porter cette gestion publique de l'énergie. Nous sommes une minorité, mais pourtant, nous avons raison. Et nous devons nous battre pour faire avancer nos idées parce qu'il y a urgence. L'énergie est un bien essentiel. Il n'a absolument aucune vocation d'être géré par le marché. Et c'est de ça qu'il s'agit aujourd'hui ici. C'est pour ça que je suis heureuse de voir que nous sommes si nombreux à nous battre pour cela. Mais c'est une bataille aussi que nous allons demain devoir porter au niveau du Parlement européen. C'est une bataille qui s'inscrit dans le temps long, on le sait, parce que nous avons face à nous un système capitaliste, des politiques néolibérales qui vont s'opposer frontalement au projet de société que nous sommes en train de porter ici. Mais nous sommes déterminés, nous sommes nombreux et nous ferons entendre raison sur ce sujet. C'est pour ça que je vous remercie encore une fois de m'avoir invité ici, de pouvoir partager avec vous cette expérience européenne qui est évidemment pas du tout un modèle, au contraire, c'est un contre-modèle de tout ce qu'il ne fallait pas faire, qui a été fait. Mais en tout cas, désormais, nous devons avancer avec détermination vers cette gestion publique de l'énergie, ce bien essentiel pour toutes et tous. Et je vous remercie donc encore une fois de votre invitation.
Thank you, Marina. That's great. Fantastic intervention. Joel is now going to discuss aspects of, in terms of what a South-South cooperation might mean for a continent that really has a really deplorable state in terms of its utilities have been bankrupted by neoliberal policy, electrification levels. I don't have to tell you, all the data is there. And we touched on it earlier, so without any further delay, Joel, your response, new international energy order or something else?
Thanks, Sean. And good evening, comrades. You forgive me if I say I'm still struggling with jet lag unusually, but we'll get used to it maybe by tomorrow. But first, let me say that we agree very strongly with the points that have been canvassed with the paper in terms of where we are today with the marketization of the decarbonization effort, the failures. On our continent, you can see it writ large. With respect to, by the way, the figure says 600 million Africans are disconnected from energy sources. Please, you might need to revise that figure, especially with a lot of governments claiming to take away subsidy from energy, electricity, and quite a number of them also increasing the prices of electricity. So many persons are getting disconnected by the day. In some part of our continent, we even argue that our people pay for darkness because the bills come, but there's no electricity. And so they are forced to pay for darkness. Nevertheless, we also agree that we need to recall the retreating and the captured states to function effectively. We agree that, and then this is by way of information, that when we talk about the fact that the Green Deal has failed, for us on the continent, we see Europe as even more corporate today in the failure. And in other words, Europe has prided itself as a champion for the Green Deal. But we will say on our continent that it's even more corporate in the failure. And on our continent today, the struggle for critical minerals has assumed a militarized approach, sponsored in part, tacitly and covertly, by Europe and the US. The DRC is an example today. What you see happening in Goma, in Eastern DRC, is a pure reflection of that. We see very strongly that when we talk about the crisis of energy and what we need to do, the face of how it is grim on our continent is the face of a woman. That our women, folks, even at formal employment or those in the informal economy, suffer the brunt the more. Because in most households, the responsibility to organize families lies most effectively unfairly with women. From COP29, when we came back, we are very, very disappointed that the finance approach or the financing expectations were not anything near what we thought. But comrades, and this is where my presentation starts, to say that with the paper, the document that we have, ours is to offer what is it that we can do. Yes, we agree with a new international energy order. We also think, yes, the South has a role to play, because first is that we are the people most concerned. We can't leave our struggle to others. We must lead our struggle. And so we agree that it is incumbent on us to do so. Number one, we have told ourselves, and this is what I want to say to this gathering, lamentation is not an option. We have taken that off the table. We do not have the luxury of lamentation. Number two, slogans, they are very good, but they cannot go far. They will only go far if we are able to do the following. And these are the things we really want to speak to. The prescriptions on how the Global South can lead. Number one, we need to continue to resist this whole approach of a private sector-led energy justice that is never, ever going to happen. As it is historical for all other spheres of life, including the public services and all, it is the same with the issue of energy. We need to continue to resist. And then in terms of how, they are not scientific at all. And in this room, there are replicates, so many good examples of how resistance is shaping this struggle positively. For us on our continent, our awareness and education of our people on the just transition, the climate change work is still very small. We want to continue to increase that. Why do we say so? Because ultimately, this struggle is not about just us in this room. The struggle is about the people. And when we say power to the people and all power to the people, there is a sense of correctness that is embedded in that fact that the people must be at the heart of mobilization for change. And if we have not been able to really get the people involved, then our struggle still needs more work to be done. Secondly, is that, and of course, in this mobilization that we are talking about the people, the alliance that we see here is remarkable. Sean has said it, from Nairobi for me to here, this is a big improvement of how a TUED has transitioned, so to say. We call it trade union energy democracy. But look at this room. It's not just trade unions that are here. There are progressive organizations, the larger or the broader social movement that are in this room. This is how it should be. In terms of the alliance, we must be conscious to do this. The only advice we will prefer is that please, let not our issue or our messaging divide us. We should. And I'm not a fan of ideological purity. That it has to be all left and strong and pure. It has to be all center. No, I'm not. I panter more towards progressive agenda. If you then say progressive is a radical left, I am there. If you say it's the center, you'll find me there. But what is progressive for moving our people together? In other words, What I'm saying is that let not our ideological differences that is not pure or impure divide us. We must move together. And in doing so, we must be able to find minimum messaging that unites all of us. That's another point I want to make. To say, comrade, clearly, COP30 will be an important process. And December last year, we had a meeting with the Brazilian government. We met with President Lula. And the message he gave us were very inspiring. And this is where I'm going to connect COP30 and politics together. To say first, it is important for us, I don't know, where are the Brazilian comrades in this room? There was time, okay, thank you. Very few, scanty, 2. We must bond with the comrades from Brazil, because for us, from Africa, we say to ourselves that any terrain of struggle must not be allowed or left unoccupied. And so for us, the G20 space, for instance, is a terrain of struggle. We are effectively occupying that space. And so we are happy that from Brazil to South Africa, the G20 is moving. Don't forget, comrades, from South Africa, it will move to the US. And so we should prepare for that disruption. So how do we get the Brazilian comrades to work with our South African comrades effectively so that our message finds space within the G20? It is critical for us. Europe has a lot of countries within the G20. And so our message can also get seized there. And finally, so I stop quickly, is to say politics is important. Comrades, something very dangerous is happening before our very eyes. We may, reckon with it, but we may think it will take time, but it's already here. The fact that Trumpism, I don't know, for want of a better name, is assuming a global identity is something we must not take lightly. What it means is that America wants every other country, big economies, to be like itself, to reflect America. And so, America will be interested in the UK election, even forcing the government to call on any election. We'll be interested in France's election. We'll be interested in Germany's outcome. We'll be interested in all. And then for our own small countries in the global south, with strong digital tools in their hand, disinformation and misinformation, they are stealing and winning our elections at will. And so they are able to control our government to drive this agenda. Comrades, politics matters in this trade. We will win this argument when in our different countries, a pathway solidly, just like we hear in some countries, become or resonate stronger in our national electoral processes and in our seats of government. In Africa, that is not the case yet, but in very few spaces. But we want to see that resonate better. Finally, we cannot say this, we cannot overemphasize or say it less. The financing is critical. Africa needs the finance. And we are not begging. And this is why, as part of the strategy of financing, we are recalling very strongly the issue about reparation. We are going back to our reparation argument more than ever before. That if you have taken so much on account of slavery, on account of colonialism, and of course even on account of even the destructions in the 1980s through structural adjustment programs, then this is the time to begin to ask you to pay. And to pay, you must. Wise they are not, and TUED cannot just be South. And we are happy, even TUED that is South is headquartered in the United States. So we will need our allies and comrades from the global north who understands this struggle so that together our arguments can resonate better in other spaces of further engagement. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Sean, and yeah, let me also bring solidarity greetings from War on One to TUED, and of course to all of our comrades here. For those of you who don't know, War on One, we were founded by the labour movement, based in the UK, and focus on the root causes of poverty, inequality and injustice. And we work directly with trade unions, workers' organisations and frontline communities all over the world, including in the global north, building power. And our work spans from workers' rights, right to food, right to energy, to tax, trade, debt, corporate power. We take a very systems analysis and a perspective. And say it's really heartening to think about where we are and to have this conversation. And I'm really torn because part of me wants to do the first bit of the doom, this is how terrible things are, and then say, but for those of you, those of us who came into the climate justice movement, came out of the anti-globalization movement, the economic justice movement, that moment when we were able to build a movement of movements, when we were on the streets about the WTO, about Davos, etc. And out of that, when we looked at climate, and just remembering back to that moment where, climate was framed as polar bears on icebergs, right? As about empty calls of action. Didn't matter what action, by who or what for, that was the only thing that needed to be happen. That actually, by simply making calls on climate, governments would do the right thing and somehow miraculously, carbon would be reduced. And those of us who formed the climate justice movement back in the early 2000s, said, this fight isn't about simply reducing carbon. It's about reducing and ending injustice, understanding and bringing that structural analysis to that fight. And I'm just remembering back even the journey of TUED being formed, but sitting in Copenhagen in 2009 and listening to Ambassador Lumumba, who was the chair of the G77 at the time. He was the ambassador from Sudan. And those of you who might be in Copenhagen might remember, he sat there, he had his head in his hands, tears were falling down his face, and he said, we've been asked to sign a suicide pact. And Africa is being asked to celebrate this deal with $10 billion, which isn't even enough to buy us coffins. He said, I would rather die with dignity than funnel my people into a furnace. 2 degrees is a death sentence for Africa. This is climate fascism. And of course, he went on, he said, it's incredible that after 500 years of interaction with the West, we're still considered disposable. And of course, that disposability, as we know, is that arc of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neoliberalism, and ultimately the result of climate as well. But just taking a stark moment to just reflect on where we are at this moment. We have, on current emissions, global emissions, less than 6 years of current emissions before we breach the 1.5 degrees. We have less than 2 decades before we breach 2 degrees. And the UN emissions gap report that came out earlier this year before COP29 said we're going to be at 3 degrees by the end of the century. And all of these are on two-thirds possibilities, right? None of us would leave this room and get into a train, a bus or anything if there was a 1 in 3 chance of that bus crashing and killing us all. But all climate policy is based on that, on probabilities, right? So that these targets are all about 2 in 3 chance of us meeting the 1.5 degree target or the 2 degree target. So we know that this urgency of the climate is real because, of course, we see what the result of that already is in devastation and overwhelming of so many of our countries and of our peoples and of our communities all over the world in the global south. But we don't face just one crisis. We've got this crisis of global inequality, right? And of course, we've heard it earlier today. It's not just about, as you said, the 800 or 900 million people in Africa who currently don't have access to electricity. It's the fact that we have half the world who doesn't have access to clean cooking and clean energy, right? It's about, we have half the world that is surviving on about $7.50, right? Not enough, not out of poverty. If we wanted to have people out of poverty, we know that that would be at least a minimum of $15 a day, at least a minimum of $15 a day. And we're so far, we have a system where, of course, 1.7 billion people lack housing, 1 billion people still go hungry, we have a crisis of 1 billion people don't have access to fresh water. Our crisis of inequality, that has largely, for decades, been in the global south, and of course is now being visited on the global north. The same structural adjustment programs, the same privatization, the same attacks on the welfare state, the same deregulation that was visited on the global south. And let's be honest, that workers in the global north were told, that's all right, because you'll have a social compact, because you'll be okay, because we, the state, the employer, and unions, we will ensure that you have a minimum level of a safety net. And of course, now that safety net is being attacked in the global north as well. But those aren't the only two crises, right? We have this crisis of resource use. We're currently breaching, 6 out of the 9 planetary limits, right? So the very ecosystems, the very systems that we all rely on for our air, water, and land are collapsing all around us. They are the ones that are necessary for food production. We currently, the World Bank says we use about 100 billion tons of resources each and every year. We should be at about 50 billion. We're about to increase to about 180 billion. So when you start to think, well, we've got this crisis of climate, of inequality, of planetary limits and resource use, and then, of course, a rigged economic system, a neoliberal economic system that, sorry, I slow, my northern thing, a rigged economic system, we have to have an answer to this. Now, Gramsci said, of course, very famously, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And of course, it is the time of monsters. And it's monsters that aren't hiding under the bed anymore. These are monsters, capital and the oligarchs, who are marching in step with the fascists around the world. And we have to accept that we are living in a period where it's the fascists who are the internationalists, where it's the fascists who are connecting around the world, where it's the fascists who have a vision that is even attracting part of our own class of working people looking to fascism as an answer to the economic uncertainties that they're facing. So we have a profound challenge. So that's why I think this paper is really important, because first of all, we have to ask ourselves and be honest, we are losing, and we're losing badly. So how do we change that? We all know, because we're all people who struggle, that to win a fight, you need a vision. You need a vision of a yes. What are we fighting for? You need demands. Transformative demands, demands that connect with people. We know that that has to connect with people's material needs. We know that, particularly on energy, where people in the global north are struggling to be able to heat their homes and feed their families, and people in the global south don't have access to energy, that energy is one of those things. We also know you have to build power by having fights. So what are the political fights that allow us collectively to build our power? And who do we need around our table to build our power? Because this fight, if it was purely able to be won by one part of our movement, we would have won it. We know we have to have a movement of movements. There is no way this climate fight or this fight is won without the labour movement. But it can't be just the labour movement. The labour movement needs other movements to stand alongside it, which means we're not just organising at the factory gate, we're actually looking at how do we organise in our societies and our economies. That tells a very, very different story. We at War and Want, working with our movements and partners, some of them who are in here, we say, look, we've got this fight. In the next decade, it's the fight about people living with dignity and in harmony with the planet. Right, that's the big fight. We know we've got this window of opportunity now where change is inevitable. The IPCC, the world's climate scientists, when they ended, they wrote the last report, that AR6, they ended that with this statement. They said, change is now inevitable. The only question is what kind of change. Now, us, from our perspective, would add a sentence to that and say, and who pays the price? and who is sacrificed in this change. Because we know that when this change has happened consistently under this economic model, it's been working people that have faced deindustrialization, been thrown on the scrap heap, etc. So how do we have a totally different story around that? And I think there is a germ of an idea we talk about in this, which is about how do you make the right to energy and the right to food, living wages, social protection, public services, part of a new vision of a new internationalism that connects our movements in the global north and the global south. Because for too long, the movements in the global north, we've asked them, do something, be nice because our movements in the global south are the ones resisting and you have to do something. Actually, now we have a common fight. Yes, we are at different stages in that fight. The global south is on the front lines, and the global north is hoping that it has its technology and capacity to be able to deal with some of the worst impacts. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty said, we have created climate fascism, where the rich will to use their wealth to seek safety and are leaving the global south, the poor to burn and drown. And of course, that is the reality we're facing. But now we have the poor who are also being left to burn and drown in the global north as well. We see that in terms of the marginal and working class communities, in diaspora communities and black communities. That gives us a possibility of a new unity and a new vision. So saying all of that, this fight, therefore, requires us to have not just some demands, but some policies, strategies, like where do we fight and how do we fight? And this is where I think this paper is so important, because we know this is no longer ideological. In the time frame that we have to transform the energy sector, it is not possible by the private sector. If it was, we would have done it for the last 30 years. You need regulation. You need a strong state. It's no good simply even arguing that decentralized energy systems are going to be enough. We have to start asking, how much energy do we need to produce? Who's going to extract how much? New materials or the fossil fuels? How much is going to be shared? And for what purpose? So we do have to start talking, and I don't want to use the word degrowth, because I think it's a terrible word for a majority of people who are still struggling, but we have to talk about what is better, right? What do we need for a functioning economy and for society? And I think then we start to look at a very different conversation around energy, not just about distribution, and not just about generation, but about extraction, which is you have to have public ownership of all three of those stages to be able to transition fairly and equitably, but also to ensure that no one is left behind, that we have transition both for workers, but also access in terms of on communities. Now, one of the areas we've felt, together with many of our movement allies, APMDD, etc., is the challenge we've got is where do we fight this fucker? Because they are fighting all over the place. They're training, moving us in the WTO at this place and at that place, and it's hard for our movements to have one target where we can show and demonstrate our power. That's why we fought very, very hard in the UNFCCC and the COP to say, let's try and get a just transition work program going there. Not in the idea that somehow we're going to win everything there, but at least it gives us a place for our movements to collectively fight, to build a common agenda and a common vision and a common set of demands, and to be able to understand how do we influence both on the outside and on the inside our governments. How do we create broader alliances so Colombia and Mexico aren't by themselves? Actually, we can create a number of countries to back them and say, actually, for an energy transition, we want not just an energy transition, we need a transition of our economies and our societies. All of those possibilities are out there, because the one thing we do know, if we don't fight, we've lost. And this is a fight that we have no choice but to fight. And so in that moment, I often say to people, above my desk, I have this quote, not from one of our heroes, but from Milton Friedman, the architect of neoliberalism. He said, only a crisis, real or perceived, produces change. And he was speaking to his acolytes of neoliberalism. He said, and our job is to keep our ideas and our policies alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And I genuinely believe that there is going to be a moment when these systems are collapsing in such a way that people and governments will be reaching out and struggling what to do. How do we intervene? And we, as the progressive movement, have got to have our ideas and policies ready and build power behind them, because we failed to do that in 2008 when the financial crisis happened. All of us predicted casino capitalism. And when it happened, we were all sitting on our hands going, oh my God, what do? We were right. We all predicted, and we saw that during the COVID pandemic, right? The pandemic happened, and suddenly all the things we'd said about neoliberalism, our own governments agreed. They threw the neoliberalism rule book out the window, intervened directly into the economy, pumped money into that, protected jobs, and of course also showed that on an issue where everybody and every citizen in the world was equally affected, the global north was still willing to sacrifice the global south, both with vaccine apartheid, but also in denial of the very resources that are needed for countries in the global south to invest in the public services, public health, because of debt repayments. So I think there are some fights coming up, and we heard about them earlier, you know, the fight around tax and wealth taxes and corporation taxes. Those are really, really important fights because the global south needs fiscal space. And the one thing we learned in the COP29 is that the global north is not going to give a penny. Is not going to give a penny to the global south in terms of this transition. So we have to look at how do we generate those resources. Tax, wealth, cancelling debt are obviously key ones. We have to fight on intellectual property rights, on technology transfers. There is no chance of a public energy system in the global south without also technology transfers from the global south. And that has to then spark regional integration and regional planning. So that is a fight. I think that is required of the global north movements and of the trade union movements in the global north to be fighting about those technology transfers, not to be saying this is about British jobs or British workers and European workers. I always remind our comrades in the trade union movement in the global north, and I'm very proud trade unions, our banners don't say workers of England unite, they say workers of the world unite. And what we now need is a new internationalism and a new movement of movements. And I think this paper is a really important intervention to help us build that framework.
Thanks, comrades. I'm just going to check with the team in terms of time. We don't have any. I've been listening, so I haven't really been following the time. I apologize. Okay. All right, we've got a few minutes. Can someone help me facilitate, because I don't have a headset if Marina wants to respond.
Yeah, first of all, I want to appreciate all the submissions. I want to draw our attention to some of the things which have been said, but especially in terms of the paper that Sean provided. Now, there's a section that talks about energy cooperation and global public goods. And also want to appreciate the Member of Parliament of EU in terms of validating the importance of public provision. However, we know that EU is one of the champions of JETPs. So that becomes a contradiction if you're really going to achieve what we want. But also at the same time, we know that IMF and World Bank are the custodians of policies of EU and US. And this is where the issue of debt actually comes in. We can talk about the Global South taking leadership. However, we should not forget that currently many of the countries in Global South are highly indebted. So at what point are we able to exercise the public policy space, especially when we still owe IMF and World Bank a lot of money? We know so many countries that have actually had their currency devalued anytime they try to exercise their public policy space. And all of a sudden, the interest rates in terms of the loans to be repaid is so high that any government will actually shrink from taking that bold step. And so I want to appreciate what the paper talks about. How do we actually find a balance between the debt threat and exercising the policy space and true intention when it comes to global South-North cooperation. But then finally, China has actually been talked about so much. Maybe one of the things we discussed in the group is that can we contextualize some of these strategies? China is already highly developed. You can't compare it to Kenya or Nigeria. And we should also not forget that China is one of the beneficiaries of the resources in DRC Congo. So they can actually not be such a good leader when it comes to Global South. That is my personal opinion. So while looking at these strategies here, can we disaggregate that those Global South countries which are already at a certain level, then there are those ones who are at a certain lower level. One strategy cannot fit all of them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think the paper, so I'm Tanya from Akhator. The paper is a very important contribution. Thank you for that, and thank you for stimulating the debate. I want to raise one or two key points. We keep talking about the need for technology transfer, as though the North has all the answers, and we ignorant people in the South need them to tell us what to do. We know that's not true. What we need is to challenge the intellectual property regime that allows people with knowledge for profit to keep making profit. And instead, we need to, like we want to renationalize corporate energy, we must renationalize intellectual property for public good. That's the one thing. The second thing we need to do is to say, among ourselves, we've heard lots of good, strong examples of what cooperation, what worker control, what community control really means. We need to spread these ideas more among ourselves, the paper, ourselves, so that we develop our own vision and see what we can implement in the future. Our solutions must come from ourselves. That's the one point. The second point is when we talk about public ownership can't be some bureaucrats deciding what to do for everybody and being lobbied by capital to pursue capital's agenda. Public ownership means we need to go to our governments. We need to go to our SOEs and say, what are you doing? Who are you serving? What conditions are workers facing? It means we need to be active in our everyday lives to enforce accountability in public ownership. We had public ownership. We lost it. Why? Because we weren't fighting every day. And unfortunately, we need to fight every day to have control over our own lives and influence our future.
Aquí. Buenas tardes, yo soy Fabiola, soy de Brasil y quería seguir dos temas. Uno, que es exactamente el papel de los bancos. Nosotros en Brasil tenemos lo que le decimos el Banco Nacional de Desarrollo Social, que al final de social no tiene nada. Y como ese es un problema internacional, ¿será que no cabería pensar un paquete de leyes que pudieran como que ponerle algunas trabas a estos fondos internacionales que entran nomás para financiar las privatizaciones y llevarse todos los recursos naturales donde pasan? Porque ese tipo de ley, por lo menos nosotros no vemos que es muy explotada, no se discute mucho, es una cosa que queda como en el aire porque son fondos que están así en nubes, nos están permeando como nubes y entran y se llevan todo. Entonces tal vez pensar cómo podríamos estar desarrollando ese tema entre nosotros para tentar en los países que están más progresistas ponerle pequeñas trabas sobre estos procesos de privatización. La otra cosa es que creo que tenemos que pensar, ya que estamos hablando en aumentar, y esta es mi primera reunión de TUED, pero estamos hablando en aumentar participación, es que aquí tenemos sindicatos eléctricos, tenemos petroleros, tenemos varias organizaciones y lo que nos falta un poco para llegar a la sociedad es la educación. Entonces, pensar en parcería con sindicatos de docentes, para además de las centrales sindicales que aquí están presentes. Nosotros en Brasil tuvimos una buena experiencia haciendo una parcería con los docentes para poder llegar a las universidades, a las escuelas, donde se forma la opinión. Porque esta cosita que uno piensa que es muy bueno hoy para nosotros es la destrucción total. Entonces creo que tal vez para una próxima pensar en cómo estar buscando también esas parcerías. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, boa tarde. Después de la intervención de la compañera del Parlamento Europeo, que quería hablar un poco efectivamente de Europa, de cómo está la situación que ella ya nos expuso, de efectivamente lo mal que está, ¿no? Pero bueno, Europa hizo méritos suficientes para estar como está. En primer lugar, se habla de que ha avanzado el fascismo en Europa. El fascismo ahora está instalado, pero ya lo tenemos en Europa hace muchos años, ¿eh? Ya en la anterior etapa europea estaba totalmente instalado el fascismo y la propia Unión Europea ya en sí misma ya es una institución antidemocrática, bastante antidemocrática. Por mucho que exista un Parlamento, ya sabemos que las decisiones no se toman ahí, sino en el Consejo de Europa y en otras instituciones. Como decía el otro día Tirio Borón en otra actividad de la que vengo precisamente ahora, decía que Europa, la Unión Europea, mejor dicho, cuando hablamos de Europa hablamos de la Unión Europea, cada vez se parece más a la OTAN, a la NATO. Y por eso está efectivamente en la situación que está en este debate que estamos teniendo energético, ¿no? Porque la situación que tiene ahora de haber roto con esa agenda energética de las renovables que tanto se hablaba en Europa y todo eso, se ha roto, ¿por qué? Porque evidentemente no interesaba que aquella iniciativa que tuvo la señora Merkel, no muy sospechosa de ser de izquierdas, pues evidentemente no se podía consentir que Europa empezase a comerciar y tuviera relaciones económicas con Rusia. Por eso tenemos una guerra ahí en nuestras fronteras. La guerra de Ucrania, uno de los motivos principales es este. Y pasamos, por lo tanto, de tener una alternativa energética razonable a estar pagando gas a Estados Unidos un 25% más caro por el tema de Rusia, y España, por ejemplo, que también se le ocurrió romper las relaciones con Argelia, que también le servía el gas mucho más barato, ¿no? Si a esto unimos que algunos países se están cansando ya, y es lógico, me tienen toda la razón, de esta actitud neocolonial de Europa, los países del Sahel ya se están cansando de que Francia les explote y les saque el uranio para producir su energía. Si a eso le unimos que Europa, esa que fue la cuna de la civilización hace muchos años, ahora está cerrando los ojos ante un genocidio, ¿eh? Ahora está llamando rebeldes a los que hace un poco llamaba terroristas que se instalaron en Siria, etcétera, etcétera. Esa es la Europa que tenemos. Al fin y al cabo, compañeros y compañeras, esto se trata de un debate. Antes se comentaba en la política es importante. No, importante no, la política es fundamental. Es decir, esto es un debate político y económico, no nos equivoquemos. Por lo tanto, en el fondo de este debate, como discutíamos antes en nuestro grupo, está si realmente este sistema, estos modelos que nos han impuesto en la mayoría de nuestros estados y en nuestros países neoliberales son válidos efectivamente para evitar este cambio climático, para efectivamente evitar este desastre ecológico que estamos divisando, ¿no? No podemos seguir con este modelo de una avalancha de producción y de consumo que es insoportable y donde efectivamente el otro día leí un dato, es decir, por primera vez en el mundo nunca se ha producido tanta riqueza como ahora. Claro, pero la diferencia en este momento con otros momentos de la historia es que la diferencia entre los que tienen esa riqueza y los que no ha aumentado. Solo un 1% ha ganado desde 2020 2/3 más que el 99% del resto de la población. La tasa de paro está aumentando y los países que tienen sus salarios, el incremento de sus salarios por debajo de su inflación, son mayoría en el mundo. Esta es la situación que tenemos. Y luego, claro, es decir, al final esto va de lo mismo y eso tiene que ver efectivamente con un sistema neocolonial. Yo vivo en un país que, aunque está en Europa, también está colonizado. Galicia, mi país, produce 2/3 más de energía renovable de la que consumimos. No le sacamos ningún provecho. Ni nos resarcen por las consecuencias que trae para el territorio, ni la pagamos a un precio razonable, porque, como decía la compañera diputada, la pagamos a precio de gas. Por lo tanto, es siempre la misma historia. Unos países tienen recursos y los que los explotan son los que no los tienen.
How many more?
Let's get a sense of the room because we don't, we come a long way. We don't want to cut off discussion prematurely, but we also don't want to lose people through fatigue and loss of concentration. So should we take 5 more? Okay, that's. Well, we are discussing the actual paper tomorrow afternoon, so please, comrades, take a look at it. And if those points that you were about to make are germane to what we're trying to do in that session, then we'll have another opportunity. Is that reasonable? Because the interpreters have had a long day and they've done a fantastic job. And we do want to hear, a closing comment from the speakers. Is that okay? Yeah, I'm looking at you because... Okay. All right. Thank you, comrades, for your attentiveness. And why don't we... there was a couple of questions addressed at Europe around the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and the neo-colonial, but I'll leave it to you, Marina, to respond to that.
Alors, il y a certaines questions, je ne suis pas sûre d'avoir compris par rapport à l'interprétation. Donc, j'espère avoir saisi l'essentiel. Il y avait une question qui était relative à la dette et le fait qu'effectivement, nous sommes extrêmement critiques par rapport à la Banque mondiale. Et donc, le fait que cette Banque mondiale, à chaque fois qu'elle met de l'argent sur la table, elle le conditionne à des conditionnalités d'austérité qui ont été dévastatrices dans plusieurs pays du monde. Donc en fait, je partage la camarade, je ne sais pas si elle est... Je crois qu'elle n'est plus là. Bon, en tout cas, je lui répondrai peut-être plus tard parce que je ne la vois plus dans la salle. Mais en tout cas, on pourra redébattre ensemble de la Banque mondiale. Bueno, quizás puedo hacerlo en español para la parte, el colega que estaba diciendo por lo que está pasando en Europa. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que está diciendo. De hecho, comparto todos los puntos mencionados. Y de hecho, yo vengo de un partido que está totalmente contra este sistema capitalista, neocolonial, este sistema que utiliza los recursos humanos sin pensar al futuro. Esto sí, de hecho, yo comparto lo que estabas diciendo. No sé si era una pregunta, era más un comentario. Y entonces se necesita a este momento una ruptura importante con el sistema y es lo que estamos nosotros pidiendo en el Parlamento, un Parlamento que es un poco extraño porque es el único Parlamento del mundo donde no hay un poder legislativo, porque estamos un parlamento que no propone la ley, es decir, que es el Consejo y la Comisión Europea que propone la ley y nosotros solamente podemos cambiar unas cosas, pero no tenemos la iniciativa legislativa. Así que pues luchamos, pero estamos una minoría dentro del Parlamento para querer cambiar totalmente el sistema y tener una ruptura con el sistema actual. Así que la lucha sigue, es difícil, por eso lo que decía, estamos minoritarios dentro del Parlamento, lo sabemos. Pero también en Francia, yo sé que, por ejemplo, el partido donde yo vengo, el partido de izquierda, es un partido que a la última elección presidencial hizo 22%, entonces estábamos muy cerca de estar a la segunda vuelta y es decir también que es posible que un sistema muy diferente puede ganar las elecciones en mi país y también en Europa, entonces tenemos que luchar con fuerza para cambiar las cosas. Así lo dice en español. Yeah, she's not here anymore.
Oh, Evelyn's not here to hear the response.
So I don't know if there is another question. No. Le français, c'est toujours bon ou c'est bon? Et la dernière question, c'était... C'est bon le français, maintenant? Non? Ok. Ok. Je peux terminer... Ok. Para el espagnol, no. Ok. Donc oui, juste pour terminer donc, sur les questions qui étaient posées, qui étaient liées au fait d'interpeller les parlementaires, le fait d'être acteur. Alors je pense aussi qu'effectivement, comme le disait l'un d'entre vous, que la politique est primordiale. Et effectivement, il s'agit aussi de prendre toute sa place dans les mobilisations qu'on peut avoir dans l'interprétation des parlementaires, que ce soit au niveau européen, que ce soit au niveau national, parce que c'est une lutte politique. Et le combat doit se mener aussi à ce niveau-là. Donc oui, nous l'amènerons en tout cas, nous, au niveau européen. Nous interpellons le plus largement possible. Nous continuerons à le faire avec tous les pays du monde, puisque c'était la question de l'interpellation des parlementaires. Moi, je pense que j'ai répondu aux deux questions qui étaient plutôt des commentaires d'ailleurs que des questions sur le fond. Mais bon, voilà, et aussi peut-être juste un point supplémentaire sur la planification, parce qu'on a parlé justement du développement des différentes énergies. Pour vous donner un exemple concret, parce qu'on parle effectivement du nucléaire, des énergies renouvelables, mais en ayant un focus seulement sur les énergies renouvelables, par exemple photovoltaïques et éoliennes pour l'Union européenne. Mais ça veut dire que quand on a décidé ça, on a mis de côté un certain nombre d'énergies renouvelables. Je pense notamment à la géothermie, parce qu'il y a des pays qui nous font de grands enseignements. Je pense au Kenya, qui a développé des énergies de géothermie qui sont aujourd'hui jusqu'à 50% du mix énergétique. Je ne sais plus s'il y a des camarades du Kenya dans la salle. Mais donc, c'est-à-dire que nous, par exemple, nous avons totalement abandonné le développement de cette énergie parce que les intérêts privés parce que des intérêts privés considéraient que ce n'était pas assez rentable. Donc derrière aussi le choix du mix énergétique et de quelles énergies on développe, c'est pour ça qu'il doit y avoir la puissance publique, la puissance qui planifie les différents besoins énergétiques et qui flèche sans que le privé s'en mêle, parce que lorsque le privé s'en mêle, eh bien justement nous ne développons pas certaines énergies au détriment des autres.
Thanks, Marina. Great intervention. Joel, can you go next, please? And obviously, we're up against the clock here. Sorry.
No, just to say that, to appreciate the contributions from the floor, also to say we agree also in terms of how we need to really engage. In terms of the Global South leading, our take is that maybe we start from the Global South People's Movement. Pushing Global South government to get to that place. So we need to be clear that amongst and between ourselves, we need to do this more. And then I will reiterate, we will also need the collaboration and solidarity of our comrades and brothers and sisters from the global north. My brother put it very clearly. Ideologically, the poverty is everywhere. It's not only the south. The north is also feeling it. So we need that collaboration between and amongst ourselves. Critically also is that once we start doing this, comrades, we should be sure that the resistance we will receive is not going to be a small scale, beyond anything. And I will repeat, with disinformation and misinformation, so much effort that we have made, we have seen retraction. We have seen us lose ground. So as much as we are conscious of this, and then we will continue to build forward better, the chances of having a strong South-led climate change just transition push becomes much real. I think by the time we come tomorrow, we will still harvest more thoughts on how this can be done. The crises are not just one, I still agree. How we link them together to frame a bigger picture that connects all of us, including the movement that are not in this room, is critical for us.
Thanks, Asad. That's brilliant. Yep. I think I just wanted to agree with Tanya about the trade regime. I think in terms of IPRs, particularly, when we look at the neoliberal economic system and you think, how do you dismantle it? And there are many things we have to do. If we don't dismantle things like ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Court, and on IPRs, there's no possibility of transformation on anything else. And I think that's a really key part, of course, then pushing to the European agenda. I just wanted to, just whilst you were talking, remembering Walter Rodney when he wrote that, you know, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, or reality, how Africa developed Europe, right? And the stark reality is, of course, that Europe still controls majority of those resources. City of London controls more of Africa's mineral metal wealth than the entire GDP of every sub-Saharan country put together. All of its energy production, including much of it, all those pathways are leading back to Europe, right? The solar, the gas and oil pipelines are all about resourcing there. And we know that both the European Union and the United States is now engaged in a resource war of like who controls access to these resources and for what. And we see that with Greenland, and we see, of course, with Trump, with Greenland, etc. So I think there's a much more profound conversation to be had about, you know, when we talk about economic sovereignty and resource sovereignty, about how we build that into our vision of how and what delinking the global south from the global north actually begins to look like. And I just want to end on one thing. You know, when people talk about like the COVID impact, I think the COVID had like a GDP impact of about 3.4% globally. And we saw what the reality meant for working people everywhere, right? Poverty, inequality being thrown on it predicted that by 2050, the climate and this combined injustice will have an 18% impact on the global economy. And it will be the poorest and working people who will pay the heaviest price. So at the same time as we're fighting for the transformation, we also have to fight for resilience. Like, how do we build resilience into our communities? And I think that's such a profound challenge for us. And hopefully tomorrow we begin to answer some of those questions.
Okay, thanks, comrades, and thank you all for staying longer and for the interpreters for being willing to stick it out with us. Just a few housekeeping issues. This evening's Women's Caucus dinner is on the first floor, and this floor, right? The first floor, yes, above us, where we had lunch. And we will be meeting at 7. It says 6:30, or it did say 6:30, but it's going to be at 7. And then also tomorrow, there is the first half of the day is the round table. And so all of you who are speaking on the round table, you have to fill out your survey. It's literally, will probably take you 2 minutes, maybe 3, but it's very, very short. And so if you can fill that out tonight, then we will be able to use it to guide us tomorrow in the session in the morning. And then I think that's it for me, and then other housekeeping.
Y ya para terminar, para todas las personas que están en el hotel, la cena será servida entre las 7 y las 9 en el piso de arriba, donde comimos el almuerzo. Y gracias, muchas gracias. Es todo lo que hice yo, lo hice todo yo. Estuve cocinando todo el día. Muchas gracias y muchas gracias de nuevo al equipo de interpretación, que son trabajadores y trabajadoras que se han quedado más tiempo con nosotros. Mañana de nuevo a las 9. Listo, nos vemos.